Okay, everybody, let's talk about rendering. So I have this little guy here. He's already textured, and these are just simple textures. So it's just color basically slapped on there. As you can see, I have milk chocolate, I have white chocolate, and then the eyes don't have a name, and they should be called, or that's not even it. This doesn't have a name. This should be dark chocolate. And the eyes are kind of a special version of that because they're extra shiny. So, shiny chocolate. And for reference, what I kind of went off of was this picture right here. This is specifically from your Bosch stuff. So I kind of changed a few things around. So you see he's not as round. And I gave him more of a trapezoid instead of just a straight up and down kind of look. And technically I should paint the underside of him white again. I guess that's a good thing to show you guys because I know some of you had those questions. So how do you, again, just do specific faces? If you grab the faces that you want to use or that you want to paint, then you can just apply the material that you want directly to them. So in this case, now that I have them all selected, I can right click, assign existing material, and I can say white chocolate. Not that you can see it because there's shadow under there, but it's there. So if you click on him, you can see that there is milk chocolate and white chocolate on both the body. So let's talk about how I have this all set up. We can hide the image plane. So when we are rendering, and remember that we are doing Arnold rendering, so when we are rendering, we want to make sure that you can use materials that aren't Arnold materials, but the best materials for you to use are going to be the AI standard. An AI standard, to get to those, you just, when you go to assign a new material, you go to shader, and you go to one of these. Standard surface is the one that is standard. But you can use a lot of these other ones as well. They do different things. Again, look at the Arnold documentation if you need to know what they do. So, but this isn't really about that. This is more about the rendering. So, I have a plane that all I've done is I put a plane down, I put a second plane, and I bridged it with a curve. So this gives us a nice floor as well as kind of a wall to bounce off of. You could also change the color of the background of your camera. I'm not a huge fan of that, but I can show you guys how to do that at a later date and time. Then on top of that, I have two lights in here. These are what are called area lights. You can change them to whatever kind of light you want. I still, again, because we are using Arnold, I suggest using the Arnold lights. So area light, sky dome, mesh, photometric light, blah, blah, blah. Area lights are going to be the ones that you're probably going to use the most often because they're just kind of the handiest. When they come in way lower intensity and way lower exposure. There's a good possibility that you won't be able to see anything in your scene. So, like, I'll show you if we take this back down to 1 and 1, and we take this light down to 1 and 1. So when they go in, that's what you go with. Like, you can barely see anything. So what you have to do, and this is kind of a complaint about a lot of Arnold lights, is the fact that a lot of people feel like they need to be more intense than they actually are, or than they're actually set to be. So, and you can put lights wherever you want. We'll talk about 3-point lighting next week, but for now, just kind of throw some lights in, make sure things look good. And it's however you feel like it, because we can also adjust exposure and a few other options inside of our renderer. But for now, that makes me happy. What I have right now, this white kind of frame, I have what's called the film gate and the resolution gate on. So all this does is say, hey, this is what you have your render settings set at, so this is what I want to render at. The other thing that I'm going to talk about is the fact that, so he looks really smooth. This is how he's actually modeled. again, we talked about this whole smooth preview thing. So 1 versus on the keyboard versus 3 on the keyboard. And it's going to be just kind of how you want. Again, rendering with the 3 is great, but if you're going to like go put it inside of a game engine, you're not going to use that quite as much. And now I'm just trying to kind of decide how I want to post them. Remember, like, you should never try and avoid having something smack in the center of your render. You want to kind of work in thirds, give a little bit more interesting play. And if you want to preview your render before you actually go into your render, you can click here, say Arnold, click the play, it'll render, it'll slowly render, but you'll be able to get a good idea of what it's going to look like. So we can say stop, because we kind of know that our lighting's good. And then you have a couple options. You can come in here and use the Arnold render, or you can come over here and use IPR or any of these other ones. IPR is the one that I prefer, only because it'll show you how it's building up. And because I've rendered before, it's not going to like do what it needs to do. If you click F5 in this window, or if you go render, you tell it to render, occasionally it's not going to be happy and it's not going to do what it needs to do. So we're going to start seeing how this is rendering. So in this view, in the IPR view, it's going to tell you down here how much percentage it's rendering. So as you can tell, mine's kind of going slow, and that has a lot to do with the fact that I'm doing 800 other things, so my renderer is having to kind of work while I'm updating other things. Yeah, because it's Saturday here, and Saturday is when I update everything else, but I thought it might be nice to show you guys this. So he looks pretty good. We've got these sliders up here so we can adjust the exposure. And if you click these, it'll tell you, it'll talk to you about like what exactly it is. And then this is going to be the contrast. So the reason why I like this renderer over the Arnold renderer specifically is that Arnold doesn't have a button for the contrast, it only has a button for the exposure. So maybe I wanted him to be brighter like that. Or maybe I wanted to take, I like this like contrast, but or I don't like the contrast and I want to pull it down and make him kind of creepy or like he's peeking through things. So you can do all sorts of things with this, and it's just, for those of you who have done in other programs, it's basically post-processing. It's a baby version of post-processing. So if you like this, what you can do is you can come to File, Save Image, and it may be on something else. Always try to save your thing as a PNG. And save it as whatever name you want. So in this case, I'm going to call it Critter Lowlights. And one of the things that you may have noticed, save image, was that I had it on raw image. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out as the color managed image. That way you can kind of see what the difference is. And then if we come over here and we go to Documents, so lowlights. This is the raw image. This is the image without the color management. So this does not look like what we have set up in our render. Notice how that's like, that's not it. That's not what we want. But if we go over to the one that's light managed, that looks exactly the same. So that's what we want to do. So always make sure that you have your lights managed. Otherwise, you're going to get a really dark render and not know what's happening. Because your render view is going to look great, but your image isn't. So just make sure that that's it. Now, one of the things about this render, and it looks pretty okay, it's not actually a bad render, but if we zoom in, we can see all of this pixelation. all of this really bad pixelation. And because of the way I have the lights, we're not seeing it as much around like the eyes or anything like that. But the reality is that it's there. Like you can kind of see it here, but it's really noticeable on the floor. To fix that, there's lots of different ways. There's lots of different things. Like if you go into your render settings, when you come into Arnold, you have all these different things that you can play around with, and this has to do with how everything looks and what it actually renders. The more you push these up, the longer it is going to take to render, so just be aware that that's an issue. But realistically, the first thing, especially if it's something that you can see in a shadow, so all of these affect different things. So if it's something that you're seeing like bad inside of the shine, you're going to up your specular. But if it's something that you're seeing that's wrong inside of like the shadow, what you're going to do is you're going to actually fix your lights. So if you come to your light, you're going to see it may be here. If it's there, click Attribute Editor. Because what you're wanting to do, and this is also a great place where you can change if you want it to be a disc instead of a square or a rectangle. You can choose to change the way that the light is, and you can choose to change the way the spread is and everything else. But the big thing here that I want to talk about is samples. So samples, by default, the lights go in at a 1. Both Arnold and Maya tell you that this should be at least a 3. And this is also cool because you can put a light in, so you're going to find that inside of games, inside of rendering, you're going to do a lot of faking with lights. So maybe occasionally you have the most beautiful lighting, but there's still something that is not lit to your satisfaction. So you just want to shine a light on it, but you don't want to make it cast any shadows. That's where you're going to do this as well. So if you don't want it to cast a shadow, you can click that off. So if we change our samples to 3 on both of these lights, and let's make sure that that kept that. Okay, so now when we go to render, as it thinks about rendering maybe. As it thinks about rendering and rendering and rendering. One, you're going to see that it's going to move a little bit faster, and that's because it already has the base render data, so it's like, hey, I don't really need to do, what work do I need to do? So that's one of the cool things about rendering, is that it's a little bit smarter, but now you can see that it's kind of slowing down because it's thinking, but you're going to start to see, if it will let me, you're going to start to see where this is actually already smoother, like you're not seeing as much noise down there. And we'll see as this gets up further and further, we'll start getting better and we won't see as much noise. The other issue that you may find are fireflies. Fireflies are tiny little pixels that make it look like that you have dead pixels everywhere. They're not dead pixels. I mean, I guess they could be dead pixels on your screens, but generally they're not dead pixels. It's just that your renderer has decided to do these weird flares. And there's a bunch of different ways to fix that. But so see, where we had all that pixelation down here before, now we're nice and smooth. So now we have the render that we would want. Now we have, and again, we can maybe adjust this however we feel fit to fix this. So, and then you would just render this out. And the point is, when you're rendering, you always want to make sure that when you start out, you're going to start out at a smaller version, so 960 by 540. When you go to render something that you're going to be proud of, and after the bug, you're going to render bigger things. You're going to go into your settings and common settings, and you're going to up this. You can use a preset, so you can tell it to do a full 1024 or a full 1280. But you're going to want to be bigger than, or 720 or 1080. 720 is like the minimum that I want for this class. 1080 would be great, but I know for some of you, rendering is going to take forever. So just be aware that these are the two that I would prefer you to have. So, Arnold Renderer, all of these are options. We will maybe not really look at these next week because a lot of them are going to be things that you're not going to use. But we'll talk a little bit about what these all mean. And basically just note that each of them controls something different, and if you're not using, like we're not using transmission, so we can turn that all the way down to 0. And you'll see, because the render is still active, it's re-rendering while we're messing with things. And transmission just means transparency. So all of these have to do with whatever you want. Camera is really cool because that's your anti-aliasing. And those of you who are big gamers, that means not making things look pixelated. So occasionally you want to turn that down, like to 0, so that you can get like a pixelated edge, especially when you can combine it with a toon shader, because it can get some really cool effects. So in the same way, when you're using the toon shader, there's a bunch of other things. Like, you can't be on Gaussian, you have to be on contour. So just note that there's lots of things. And there's things inside of your system. There are things you shouldn't have to mess with most of these. You will probably have to mess inside of here, because this is where you're going to switch all your cameras around. This is where you're going to do whatever you want to do. And then Arnold, you will also mess with this tab. Not as much, because we're not hopefully going to worry about things like motion blur. This is where you can change kind of your atmosphere and your background stuff. But we shouldn't have to worry about anything with ray depth. Unless you get really fancy with things. So, yeah. So technically we have a new render. This just messed up, but because we don't have any transmission, we didn't need it, and that's really what I have to say about that. So with that said, that's basically your quick crash course into how to render something. And remember that this render panel isn't going to look the same as what you're actually rendering, and that if you are modeling or after you check it out inside of here, to always switch back to your viewport 2.0. Otherwise, your system will bog down, things will go crazy slow. That may have actually been part of my issue. But yeah, so that's it for today. I just wanted to give you guys a quick video because I know it's been asked a few times, how do you render? Hopefully you guys are having a great weekend and you're not pulling your hairs out over the bugs. Please don't. Please keep them simple. Please do what you can do. It's your first project inside of Maya. It's not meant to be something monumentally awesome. It is not something that you will share in your portfolio. Not really, not generally. But it's good for you guys to learn how to move and manipulate shapes. So yeah, I will see y'all when I see y'all.